So what actually creates behavioral change, if we really look at our brain, our learning circuitry, which is kind of, we can think about our hippocampus as a part of our brain that sort of relates to learning circuitry, is very closely connected to our emotional circuitry, and specifically our negative emotional circuitry. And so in order for us to change our behavior, the most powerful thing that can change behavior is actually the experience of negative emotion. So I'm working with someone who's engaged, and it turns out that he recently found out that his wife, his fiance was unfaithful. And so like that caused him a lot of emotional hurt, and also like drastically changed his behavior towards her, right? If we think about like the way that you treat your fiance, you treat them one way, which is like a very intensive behavior in a positive direction. You treat them with love and respect, and are available for them. And then after he discovered that she was unfaithful, his behavior changes like 180 degrees. It flips completely. And it's the most drastic behavioral change that you can kind of think of. So his behavior changes drastically. And one way to think about that is like, if we think about how he has changed, he's learned not to trust his wife. So if we think about behavioral change and learning, like those two things are very closely tied. And if we think about what's the most rapid way that our behavior changes, it's actually negative emotions. Let's say that you go to school one day and you get bullied for like wearing a particular shirt. That negative emotion is going to hit your brain so hard that you will never wear that shirt at school again. It is going to completely alter your behavior very drastically. And so even if we stop and accept that for a moment, if we say that, okay, fine, so getting burned is how we learn things, and it's the most drastic way to change our behavior, what does this have to do with gaming? So this is where we start to look at something called fMRI studies, which are brain scan studies. So fMRI is a kind of study where we take an MRI, which is like a scan of your brain. fMRI research sort of supports this, is that it actually suppresses your negative emotions. Right? If I'm having a bad day at work, or I just got into a fight with like my significant other, or my parents are on my case, what do you do to forget your problems? You go to a video game, right? Because while you're playing a video game, you forget what's going on in life. And so if we look at fMRI studies, what video games actually do is they shut off our negative emotional circuitry. But now let's pause and think for a second. Escapism, exactly. So if I shut off my negative emotional circuitry, what happens to my capacity to learn? Exactly. It gets stunted, right? Because our emotional circuitry, our negative emotional circuitry, exactly, you learn from failure. So our negative emotional circuitry is a key way in which we learn. Because when we get burned by something, like let's just talk about actually getting burned. If I touch a hot pan or I touch a hot stove and I get burned, I'm never going to touch a hot stove again. Remember that learning circuitry is tied to your negative emotional circuitry. So when people suppress the parts of their brain that experience negative emotions, they don't learn from their mistakes. They don't learn from their behaviors, and they have trouble getting unstuck. So another prime example, and this is something that it shares with alcohol, is alcohol. Right? So when I drink and like I get into a fight with someone, or I'm not doing well at work, instead of sitting with those feelings and letting those feelings motivate me to do more and change and learn, if I drown my sorrows in alcohol, nothing is going to happen. Because I'm literally shutting off that painful, which is relief, right? And so that creates escapism. And the problem with escapism is that it doesn't help us change. And so then gamers end up feeling stuck, right? Because you guys wake up every day and you know that there are things that you need to be doing differently, and you know exactly what it is because y'all's fluid IQs are 20% higher than average, and yet you can't bring yourself to do it. And you just can't bring yourself to do it. And you know, and you know, and you know, and you can't do it, and you can't do it, and you can't do it. And then you come to a conclusion, which is that I'm lazy. Normally, like, negative emotions cause us to change in our life because we direct those negative emotions towards real life. What happens in gaming is that we start to, like, a lot of, like, if you think about people who rage in video games, it's usually like people who are like upset in the rest of life, right? Like if you think about a hateful gamer, like some guy who just gets completely bent out of shape over every little thing in Overwatch, chances are that guy is not happy in the rest of his life. So gaming has a very interesting impact on how we experience emotions. And one thing that it does, and I think this has to do with gamers kind of getting stuck, is it suppresses their negative emotions. And by suppressing our experience of negative emotions, it actually disables our learning circuitry. And by disabling our learning circuitry, what that manages to do is it keeps us feeling stuck because our learning circuitry is what leads to behavioral change. So you're basically turning off the part of your brain that is the most powerful thing that can cause you to change your behavior. And then the end result is that you end up sort of living a life where like you know what you need to do, but you feel incredibly frustrated because nothing in your life is changing.